From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Dermatology Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Dermatology.
Hello, and welcome to our listeners around the world. You're listening to JAMA Dermatology Author Interviews. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Adamson, the web editor for JAMA Dermatology and host of this podcast episode. Over the past 2 decades, there has been a rapid expansion in the availability and use of specialty medications, including biologics. And these medications have dramatically improved outcomes for patients with inflammatory skin disease. At the same time, care delivery models have also evolved, with nurse practitioners and physician assistants playing an increasingly prominent role in caring for patients with skin disease, including prescribing these complex and costly medications. In a new JAMA Dermatology study, researchers evaluate the contribution of advanced practice clinicians to drug spending trends in dermatology, with a focus on specialty medications. This work raises important questions about how specialty medications are used in real-world practice and what this potentially means for scope of practice, quality, and cost of care. Dr. Arash Mostaghimi is a board-certified dermatologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital and an associate professor of dermatology at Harvard Medical School, both in Boston, Massachusetts. He is the senior author of this work, and he's here to discuss these findings and the potential implications. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Mostaghimi.
Thank you very much, Adewole. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and it's great that you reminded me offline that it's been 20 years since we first met. So, man, we're getting up there.
That's why it's an audio, not a video podcast today.
All right. So glad to have you back and glad to talk about drug costs. It's something that you and I actually have published papers together on many years ago, and you're still at it.
Yeah, as you mentioned, we live in such an interesting time where we have these amazing new therapeutics for dermatology. And we can treat people faster and with greater depth of improvement and really with a much better safety profile than we ever have. I remember when I was a resident, we were so excited when ustekinumab was coming as our 4th biologic for psoriasis. And now we have over a dozen to pick from. It's unbelievable. And that same level of innovation is now occurring in atopic dermatitis. We're beginning to see it in alopecia areata and hidradenitis. Vitiligo, exactly. So it's really an exciting time that we can do all these wonderful things for patients. Now the question comes, how do we do it in a sustainable way? How do we do it in a safe way? And really, how do we do it in an accessible way? How do we make sure that the large number of patients who are suffering from these diseases can get access to clinicians who can connect them with the appropriate treatment?
Yeah, and as I alluded to in the introduction, at the same time, the demand for our services as dermatologists has also grown a lot, and the amount of dermatologists that have been produced hasn't necessarily been commensurate with that demand. So we've had an expansion in the amount of advanced practice clinicians that have helped provide care to patients with skin disease.
That's exactly right. So the number of residency slots for dermatology has grown very slowly. And the overall population of dermatologists has correspondingly increased only about 1 or 2% a year, taking into account retirements and similar people leaving the workplace. In contrast, the number of APCs is expanding rapidly to the extent where by the early 2030s, the majority of clinicians providing dermatologic care in the United States will be APCs based on projections, not from this work, but from other data.
Not to jump too far ahead, actually, in this data, it appears as though the amount of APCs that you documented back in the 2010s, like 2013, was around 10%. And in 2022, it jumped to almost 40%.
That's exactly right. So not only are the number of APCs increasing, but the number of specialty prescriptions that they're writing for is also increasing, both in terms of intensity, meaning how many prescriptions is each person writing, but also in terms of people who never wrote prescriptions before, but then now they're starting to write prescriptions for specialty medications. And in many ways, I think this is a very positive finding. I'll speak from the perspective of somebody that takes care of a lot of patients with alopecia areata. Alopecia areata right now has 3 JAK inhibitors that are approved. Unfortunately, these are not expressed in this data, which ended in 2022 before these medications were approved. But one of the struggles I have for my patients is that, patients with alopecia areata with the severe phenotype will go see somebody and they may get the right diagnosis. They may have the right insurance to see that person. They may even have insurance that covers the right medicine, but they're still being told that clinician doesn't feel comfortable prescribing that medication, or they need to go to a different doctor to do that. Very similar to how, psoriasis was in the early days. So on one hand, this is a very nice expansion of services, and hopefully patients who need these medications are able to get them and able to take advantage of them.
Right. So I know we've already somewhat jumped into the data because I find this study quite fascinating. But let's reel it back a bit and talk about the origins of this study. This is in some ways a follow-up study to a previous one that you published looking at just overall cost of specialty medications in the Medicare population. You mind starting there with that study and then teeing up why you then did this specific study?
Yeah, so our initial paper really focused on the question of what is happening to drug spending in dermatology, really between specialty medications and generic medications. And what we identified was that the amount of money spent on generic medications as a proportion was reducing over time. And there was a massive expansion in the amount of dollars spent on specialty medications. So historically, in data between 2013 and 2022, it saw that spending increased from $768 million in 2013 to $2.95 billion in 2022. But 98.4% of that growth was from specialty medications. So in 2013, only 30.8% of all dermatology drug spending was from specialty medications, but now that's 80.9% in 2022. Even though the overall percentage of prescriptions that are specialty medications, and Adewole, maybe it would be better to take a moment to explain what specialty medications are. So when you're writing your regular topical steroids, your fluorouracil, these types of generic medications that you just write for somebody and they pick up at a regular pharmacy, those are not specialty medications. Specialty medications are higher cost medications that are sometimes small molecule inhibitors like a JAK inhibitor, but often a biologic medication. And they're usually prescribed by a specialty pharmaceutical. They require more prior authorization, more evaluation, and often are more complex in terms of their monitoring required, and the safety profile is a little bit different. So these medications, the biologics that we have come to use so much, although they're only 2.9% of prescriptions, they account for 80.9% of all costs. So you can see this small number of prescriptions is really what's driving this overall trend that we're seeing in increased spend.
You saw that the drug spend is going up over time, largely driven by these expensive, but also highly effective medications. And so now you pivot to the current study, which is driving this podcast, which is looking at how advanced practice clinicians are also using this medication. What data set did you decide to use to establish this? And how did you set up the study?
So this data was also from the Medicare Part D data. So the numbers I'm giving you are really just the Medicare spending. They don't account for the commercial spending, which is really the predominant amount of money that's spent on these medications. But the nice part about the Medicare Part D data is that you can attach the spending to a specific individual. And today, one of the major challenges that we have, and anybody who's looking at APCs has, is that unlike physicians where we are noted as being dermatologists or we're giving a primary specialty, APCs don't have that designation. So the core thing that we were able to do in this data set was we were able to look at billing, and we used a approach that has been validated previously, looking at dermatology-specific coding from these APCs to identify them as clinicians who are primarily taking care of dermatology patients. We didn't want to be accounting for some of these drugs, for example, adalimumab, which may be written for inflammatory bowel disease or some other condition. We didn't really want to account for rheumatology or gastroenterology spend. This probably underestimates some of the spend in this population, is a little bit more conservative, but gives us a nice shape of really what's being done under the umbrella of dermatology.
All right. And so now that you've told us a little bit about how you set up this study, what were the high-level findings that resulted from this?
So The main findings were that while specialty spending overall increased, as we mentioned in the last study, it was disproportionately seen by an increased amount of number of prescriptions from APCs, and in addition, an increase in the number of APCs doing the prescribing.
And did you compare that to dermatologists as well? Or did you just look at APCs in isolation?
We did the comparison. Let me walk you through the data. So APC specialty medicine costs increased from $24 million in 2013 to $744 million in 2022, which is an increase of amazingly 46.3% per year. And as a result, their share of specialty medicine spending during this time increased from 10.2% to 31.2%. So they're growing at a faster rate, and the overall pie of specialty spending is from APCs.
Although dermatologists still are a majority of that pie, but it's a shrinking majority of that pie.
That's correct. Certainly, dermatologists are still prescribing the bulk of these medications. And the increases were partially accounted for by faster growth in the number of dermatology-specific APCs. So they were increasing 10.8% annually and going from 21.2% of dermatology clinicians in 2013 to 37.8% in 2022, versus an increase, as we mentioned before, of around 1.2% annually, from around 10,000 to 11,000 for physician dermatologists.
And did these figures surprise you?
Over the last few years, I've worked a lot with the APC community, and I've noticed these trends through my own personal conversations, interactions, questions that people have been asking me. And also in my work with industry around developing and increasing access to specialty medications, in my case, specifically for alopecia areata, I realized that a lot of emphasis has been placed on the APC community. So the impetus for this really came out of my own experiences in seeing who is coming to me as a patient, what conversations am I having, and who is prescribing these medications. So my personal focus has been on increasing connections with the APC community to try to make sure that their understanding and use of these medications is accurate and appropriate. And it's really been a wonderful joy to work with them over the past few years at a couple of national conferences to discuss this care. So how I approached the study wasn't a question of what is correct or not, or what is right or wrong. In my mind, if we're going to spend a lot of time, energy, and effort to develop these medications and work through all of the roadblocks to help identify dermatology diseases as worth treating and these diseases as serious enough to warrant insurance coverage, et cetera, I really want to democratize access to these drugs. It's worth a conversation to think, how do we help support APCs in doing this? What does this tell us about our physician dermatology colleagues and the types of patients that they're seeing? And really, how do we brace for a world that my anticipation today, and this is outside of this work that we published, is that if we had data through 2025 or through 2026, we're probably right around the point where perhaps the majority of these drugs are actually being written by APCs. And certainly by later in this decade, I think physician dermatologists will take a backseat to APCs in terms of the bulk of these prescriptions.
And so that might be a surprising statement to some people, particularly dermatologists, that may perceive some of these medications as very complex, requiring a lot of drug monitoring, although drug monitoring has gone down over time. And these drugs carrying some significant safety profiles that can be life-threatening. There might be some, concern around continuing medical education, responsibility related to adverse outcomes, et cetera. I'm not casting dispersions, but what would you say to clinicians that might have that point of view?
I think there's two parts to it. So the first thing I would say is that specialty medicines is not a monolith. And there are some medications, for example, risankizumab or dupilumab, which have really excellent safety signals, are really easy to prescribe and require very minimal to no monitoring. So in that case, one question we should be asking ourselves, and that's outside of the scope of the data we have, is that are the patients being treated by APCs the same as dermatologists in terms of severity, et cetera? If they're using them inappropriately or incorrectly, or either patients who are too severe, they're waiting too long, or not waiting long enough for patients that are less severe, I think those are separate questions that are outside the scope of this work, but are important to ask. So what is patient selection and what does that look like? Also, this study is done before the JAK inhibitors and some of the other medications which do have not a bad safety profile, but a more challenging safety profile where patient selection, drug monitoring, that shared decision-making is more key and more important. And I would argue that the same question exists for physician dermatologists as our APC colleagues. How do you keep track of all these new medications? How do you know you're using the right medication for the right person? And how do you know that it's a little bit of the Goldilocks, not too much monitoring, not too little, but the right amount? And even beyond that, are we able to actually quantify the amount of people that are getting not just the standard evaluation, but if I have a patient who is at higher risk for MI or higher risk for dyslipidemia, am I adjusting my evaluation appropriately? And if you did that, you may actually identify that while globally the numbers look the way they do, maybe this is very appropriate segregation of patients where perhaps some of the most difficult patients that have requirements that make you go away from clinical guidelines to more bespoke care are being treated by physician dermatologists, whereas the type of patient being seen by an APC may be more algorithmically driven through guidelines of care, et cetera. So we can't really comment to that nature. We also can't comment to differential outcomes. Even if their more complicated patients are being taken care of by APCs, maybe they're doing just as well, in which case this is more an explanation of what we're seeing, but really maybe of net complete benefit to patients as they're getting the same level of care for better access. So the way I see this today is that the provision of dermatology in our country is changing. The people who are giving that care is changing. APCs are giving more of it. APC education is variable. There are some incredibly skilled clinicians. There's some that are very, very new. They don't have the same board certification or standards that we have as physician dermatologists. So I would ask anybody listening to this podcast to think about the emotions you feel as you see this. And that's really a Rorschach test for how you feel about APCs and the evolving world of dermatology.
That's exactly right. And I think that's one of the great parts of this study is that it raises even more questions than it answers, right? And because there's all sorts of caveats that are outside the scope of the data that you could collect that we have no idea about. I mean, we don't know whether it is a physician that is initiating the medication and APCs are more involved in the maintenance, which may require a different set of skills. It is also possible that this is expanding the access that patients get to have for sometimes life-changing medications, which is also a good thing. And I would also say it begs the question of if dermatologists are letting go of some of this type of care, what aspects of care are they emphasizing with their time? Which is a provocative question where I don't know the answer to. But you know me, I always like to ask the provocative question.
It may play a little bit into your role of the melanoma epidemic, Ade. That might be part of the answer we're looking for. I agree with all those points. And the one thing that I took from this, in addition to all the questions you raised up, maybe a couple things that I took from this. First, I have a lot of respect for our APC colleagues. They are absolutely critical. And I do agree with you that I think it's almost certain that they have expanded access in very meaningful ways. And I have a APC, I have two that I work with at my job. And my only frustration with them is that my patients like them more than they like me. So that's the only...
I get it. I get it, Arash. I get it.
But I would argue to the APC leaders, both across nurse practitioners and to PAs, that the world is moving in your direction here from a utility standpoint. And the hard part is that a lot of this is a black box. And the more that they can demonstrate who they're taking care of, what the outcomes for those patients are, and demonstrating that they are providing similar levels of care and outcomes and opening up that black box to being examined, I think the best it will be for their field in the long term. It would increase satisfaction, it would increase their credibility, and it would also identify within the APC population the same thing that we have in the medical dermatology population, where there are just some groups of people that aren't very good at taking care of patients. We need to identify these folks and figure out a way to separate them. They're either not capable or fraudulently doing different behaviors.
And that's across no matter what specialty, whether you're a physician.
100%. We don't want, in any case, though, 1% or less of folks to color the perception of the rest. So if you see the APC movement as something of an inevitability based on demographic shifts in how we are training and educating doctors in the direction that things are going, let's try to line that up so we can identify the value of APCs and really show their role and support their role in taking care of these patients.
Right. We want them to have access to the same level of knowledge, continuing medical education, and rigor that helps us deliver the best care to patients, which is at the center of all of this.
That's right.
Arash, thank you so much for joining me today and for such a thoughtful discussion of this interesting work. I should probably have you on the podcast more often. You reminded me of that today.
Any podcast I have to invite myself to, I think is the best kind of podcast. But I love JAMA Dermatology. I miss seeing you and our editor calls. And I really like the framing of this paper. And I really appreciate the ability to speak about it because I want to make sure that be very clear that I'm not presenting this as something good or bad. It just is. And I think all the questions that we brought up and understanding what this means for patients, for outcomes, and for the provision of dermatology care in the future are the important questions. And if there are gaps and deficits, we should correct them. And if it means that there should be differential oversight, less or more, right? Depending on what we find, this may be a wonderful avenue for patients to get access to the treatments. Remember, as always, if the biologic stays in the syringe on the shelf, it doesn't help anybody. We got to get into the hands of people that need the drugs.
I'm Dr. Adamson, and I've been speaking with Dr. Arash Mostaghimi about advanced practice clinicians and the rise in dermatology specialty drug spending over time in the United States. You can find a link to the paper in this episode's description. This episode was produced by Daniel Massisi at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Catch you on the next episode of the JAMA Dermatology Podcast.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.